Yeah? Yes? No echo. Wonderful. I don't know why he looks like Hannibal Lecter. In fact, I apologize. I can't even tell you exactly who that is. I think the man on the left is Gunnar Hassan. I'm not sure who the guy on the right is. Possibly Hannibal Lecter himself. Anyway, 1925, serum run to Nome, Alaska. I thought we needed a little bit of positive, uplifting pandemic content. I tried very hard to stay away, but I cannot stop thinking about pandemics, epidemics, all sorts of things. So I thought this would be a nice thing to talk about for a change. I also, as a youth, as a boy, loved the Disney animated feature Balto. I watched it probably like 4 dozen times. Probably drove my parents insane. Which we're going to learn a little bit about tonight. I learned some things that shocked and surprised and shook the very foundation of my beliefs. And hopefully you can come with me on this journey to understand the truth of the 1925 serum run to Nome, the great race of mercy. So without further ado, let us begin and see if I've done this correctly. Hurrah! There we go. Go away. So, Nome, Alaska. So in the early 20th century, Alaska is, as I'm sure you all are perfectly aware, a territory, not a state. It had been bought from Russia in, I don't actually remember. I didn't write this down. Anyway, doesn't matter. But it was an American territory, or became an American territory in the early 20th century. But in 1896, the very sparsely populated and largely uninteresting Alaska became a lot more interesting when gold was found in the area around Klondike, prompting a gold rush to the Yukon. And like all gold rushes, this didn't actually make anybody all that wealthy, but it did excite people, and it made a lot of money for people who sold shovels and overalls and supplies to miners. But 2 years later, in 1898, 3 guys who had been herding reindeer across the northern part of Alaska found gold in and around the Seward Peninsula on the northwestern tip of Alaska, and prompting a second wave of prospectors and gold rushers to head up to what is now Nome. And the basically non-existent town swelled to a population of 20,000 people in the space of about a year. Mostly due to the fact that one guy had found just gold nuggets just sitting on the beach. And everybody thought that once they arrived in Nome, Alaska, there would be gold nuggets to pick up for themselves. Unfortunately, as it turned out, there were not that many gold nuggets to be found. And a year later, or less than a year later, the literal boomtown of Nome had shrunk to a mere 5,000 people, as the 20,000 morons who went to Alaska realized that it was bitterly cold, impossible to reach from anywhere in the civilized world, and no garden gnomes. There were literally no gardens. Nothing grows. It's permafrost. I'm not sure if climate change has changed the composition of the soil up in northwest Alaska, but at the time of the gold rush, you couldn't grow anything. If you wanted to eat, you had to hunt and kill a reindeer or a seal or a whale. It was a miserable place. So, following one miserable winter, the vast majority of people who did not get rich pulled up stakes, hopped on the first steamer back to the continental United States, and went home. However, around 2,000 people remained in the town. There were about 10,000 in sort of the region surrounding Nome. Most of them worked for large mining conglomerates who had taken over what little gold there was to be found. Ooh, great question. I actually don't know why it's called Nome. Somebody can maybe help me with this. I believe that it's an Inuit or Athabascan word, but I I don't actually remember. Sorry, everybody. Anyway, it's Nome, Alaska. So 2,000 people. Oh, thank you. That's not helpful at all. So nobody knows. I don't know. Anyway, 2,000 people, 10,000 in the area around it, mostly working for one or more mining interests. So here's a map for reference. So as you'll notice, this is way the hell up there. It is just a couple of degrees south of the Arctic Circle. It is a long way from even the places in Alaska that you know. Anchorage, Fairbanks are a long-ass way away. And Norton Sound and the seas south of Nome are frozen, where they were at the time, frozen for much of the year, and it was impossible to get anything to the town except by dog sled. There was a railway from Fairbanks to Seward, as you can see, but yeah, rude, Alex. But other than that, it was basically isolated. So the citizens of Nome relied on regular shipments and cargo vessels coming in. But around October, November, the last one would head out, and they would be basically on their own until spring, early summer, when the ice would melt, which is fine if you're prepared, but not so fine if, for example, there is an epidemic in town. So, in December of 1924, Dr. Welch, Curtis Welch, who was the only doctor in town who ran the hospital with 4 nurses, noticed that several children were coming down with what he hoped was tonsillitis, but actually turned out to be diphtheria, which is a really contagious and dangerous disease that preys on children. The first sick child was a local Inuit, and it is suspected that the disease had been circulating among the native population before it came to Nome. The first couple children died before Dr. Welch was able to identify and seek help for the disease, but by then it was much too late. It was already spreading. And this is the telegram that Welch sent on January 22nd of 1925. You will notice down at the bottom that it says there are about 3,000 white natives in the district, which is important to Welch. There were most of the people, or a substantial proportion of them, were indigenous Alaskans, Inuit, Athabascans, and others, who had been devastated by the Spanish flu just, 7 years earlier. Welch is presumably highlighting this to make it clear that there are white people in Alaska worth saving as well. The U.S. government was not particularly concerned about the livelihood and health of the indigenous population. So a little bit about diphtheria before we go further. So it's a bacteria, and it is it infects the throat and sinuses. It releases a toxin that makes the infected person tired and lethargic, and that causes fever and sweats, and then you develop these ulcers and sort of like growths in your throat, which just sorts of just dead skin cells, lesions, which makes it hard to breathe, and eventually the patient suffocates, dies, often choking on their own blood. It is an incredibly unpleasant way to die. It is a truly disgusting disease, and most unfortunately, it preys mostly on children. There was a treatment for it, however, which you can see here, developed by an antitoxin created from the blood of horses who I think had been infected with diphtheria. Don't ask me how this works. I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I just know that these mustachioed guys are Prussians, and the guy that created it was oppression, and so there was a treatment for diphtheria that worked. It was an antitoxin that would prevent the buildups from happening and help children survive. The only other way to treat it was with a tracheotomy, literally punching a hole in somebody's throat so they could breathe, which reduced the fatality rate from 100% to about 75%. So this is a pretty brutal disease, and Dr. Welch was not equipped to deal with it. The antitoxin in Nome had expired. It was no longer good. And Welch had put in an order for more antitoxin earlier in the year, but the last ship either got misplaced or it was just they didn't fill it. And so he was out of antitoxin. Welch was a decent doctor, country doctor, but the hospital in Nome didn't even have a microscope, much less an incubator for creating cultures. So he really didn't have any way of dealing with this disease, even if he'd had the tools. And without the antitoxin, he was really fucked. So he used a little bit on the first couple of patients, but they needed multiple doses, and there were already several very sick children. And so he sent out this plea that you saw to, shouldn't have shown the horses. It was a mistake to show the horses. To anyone who would listen, Washington, D.C., the governor in Anchorage, anybody who could help get them some serum. And so the great race had begun. So there were a lot of different ideas of how they were going to get the antitoxin to Nome. And one of the most popular was actually not to use the dog sleds. It was to send it by airplanes. The mayor of Nome, a man named Menard, I think, as well as Representative Dan Sutherland, who was the representative for the Alaska Territory, and the publisher of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, William Fenris Thompson, whose nickname was William Wrong Font Thompson. I think because of his initials. This was a joke I didn't get. Maybe it was funnier in the 1920s. Anyway, all these people were either very excited about the brand new aviation industry and thought that they could get the serum to Nome fastest by air. Some of the people who were pushing for this had personal interest in the aviation industry, but a lot of them were genuinely excited about the idea of connecting the distant parts of the territory to others and wanted to save lives. They were very enthusiastic about it. Big time, American ingenuity, flyboy, excited about progress and technology in the future. And they really pushed for the serum to be transported by plane. However, the only flight that had ever been made to that part of Alaska had only been made the year before, and it had been deeply troubled and taken several stops. You had to bundle up aggressively. It got down to negative, 50 in certain parts, and the only planes that were available in Alaska were these flimsy biplanes that you see here. Something J's, and there were only 2 pilots in the entire territory, and both of them were out of the territory at the time. So Thompson cooked up this idea to get a man named Roy Darling, a retired Navy sailor who was working for the Justice Department with some flying experience, to hop in one of these flimsy airplanes and haul the serum to Nome that way. However, it became clear pretty quickly that was not going to work. There was another plan to maybe fly it from Seattle with a bigger, larger plane, but that was nearly 2,000 miles away. The longest flight leg had been less than 900. Some people wanted to send an aircraft carrier up as far as they would go and then fly from there. But none of this was going to work. There was basically no time. They had to get the serum to Nome as soon as possible. The diphtheria is incredibly deadly, and without the antitoxin, children were going to die. So they decided to send it by dog sled. So dogs were incredibly important to the economy, to the connection, to the people of northern Alaska. Without dog sled teams made up of Malamutes, of Siberian Huskies, mostly breeds that had been specifically bred and trained by indigenous peoples, both in Siberia and in Alaska, there was basically no connection. There was a pretty robust trail that you saw in this slide that would take you from Nenana and elsewhere to Nome. That was well frequented by dog sled teams in the pay of either one of the companies or the US Post Office, and this was really the only way to get anything in and out of Nome, especially during the winter. And it was pretty practical and it was efficient, and the guys and the dogs who ran these routes were reliable, sturdy, hardworking guys like Wild Bill Shannon, Leopard Sapala, Gunnar Hassan. You know, there were a whole bunch of these guys who ran supplies and mail back and forth, and as well as large numbers of indigenous dog sledders, mushers, who would make up all of the different legs of this connection. And it worked pretty well most of the time. But without these dogs, there really was no getting around. There, obviously you couldn't drive in a blizzard. Planes didn't work. The rail only went so far. So, winters in this part of Alaska were long, brutal. Percentage of dog sled weight has to be for dog food. That's a good question. I remember reading that most mushers would store up like 5 tons of dried salmon, like for a winter to feed their dogs with. It's a lot. Though the sturdiness and hardiness of these dogs is not to be underestimated. They need to eat a lot, but when they're racing or when they're sledding, they will push hard and go without. So if I remember correctly, they often just ate a few strips of salmon jerky or seal blubber or something like that, especially during these difficult races. So the dogs are critical to the economy, to basically daily life in Alaska, and so it falls to them to make this journey, to bring the serum from the parts of Alaska where it was found and gathered. They managed to find Welch needed hundreds of thousands of units, and they managed to find 300,000 in different parts of Alaska, enough to get them through until a ship could reach them. And these were all loaded onto a sled and sent to Nome. And this started with, I actually don't know if this is him, but anyway, this is a dog sled. It's a dog sled, good boys, howling, and it started with Wild Bill Shannon and his team of 11 Malamutes. On January 27th, they took it from Malamutes. Anyone else hear me say eunuchs? Malamutes. From Nenana to Tokavana, which is the beginning of the relay, 52 miles. And it passed from musher to musher. In the end, it ended up being 20 different teams and almost 150 dogs. About, I think, 24 of the dogs ended up dying from the difficulty. A low pressure system moved into this part of Alaska, around the time they were starting to make the relay. And temperatures dropped to -50, -64. Wild Bill Shannon wasn't able to shave for like 2 weeks because his face was too frostbitten. But it eventually reached, after passing through a handful of people, these two good boys. One human good boy, one dog good boy. Leonhard Sapala and Togo, his lead dog. Sapala was one of the main mushers for the gold mine up in Nome and was reliable. And in fact, he was supposed to have taken the serum about half the way, but midway through the relay, the governor decided to tag team a bunch of other guys to make sure that it got there faster. But he ended up sledding hundreds of miles and going through the most difficult part of the relay. And his good boy Togo was small and relatively weak for a pack dog. He was a Siberian Husky. Sapala preferred Huskies. Some mushers preferred Malamutes, but the Huskies were smaller, but strong and fast. And if you kept them warm, then they were great sled dogs. And Togo was smaller and weaker than most, but very smart. He's a very smart, hardworking, uncanny instincts that kept Sapala alive throughout the years. He was 12 at the time of the relay, an old dog and yet strong as ever. Sapala was 48. Oops, jumped ahead. When Sapala got his hand off of the serum, it was already night and the low pressure system was moving in from the Gulf. He was up near, let me take you back to Norton Sound. And so you were not supposed to take Norton Sound. It was very dangerous, but Sapala was a weathered and experienced musher, and had done it several times. It was risky because you could end up floating away on an ice floe or plunging through the ice or just dying because it was miserable and cold. But Sapala decided rather than wait, despite the gale force winds and the wind chill of negative 85 degrees Fahrenheit, to push through, and took off immediately across the ice. As he and Togo went, the gale intensified, becoming a full-on blizzard, reaching 65 miles per hour. He pushed further out to avoid the rocky cliffs, and made it across Norton Sound, though just a few hours after they crossed, the ice broke up and drifted out to sea. Negative 85 degrees Fahrenheit, that's right. It's the wind chill. I think the actual temperature was somewhere in the 60s. Pretty fucking cold. However, so there was one more team after Sapala, but eventually it was handed off to Balto. Balto and Gunnar Hassan. I think it's a reindeer fur jacket, but I don't actually know. The final sled dog team was led by a very good boy, Balto, who's all black with one white sock, and his musher, Gunnar Hassan, who you can see here with his very artful cowlick. And they were actually supposed to be the second to last leg, but Hassan got to the place where he was supposed to hand off to the next guy, saw that there were no lights in the cabin, and pushed on, becoming the hero of Nome. There was a lot of to-do about this at the time and in the future. Hassan says, and frankly I believe him, that he did not see, or that he was snowblind, and so didn't see where he was supposed to stop and just pushed on. Some people think that he was trying to claim the glory for himself, this is possibly true. What's unfortunate is that Togo and Sapala traveled far further than any other team, and through a much harder route, and deserved definitely some of the credit, quite a bit of it. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to see it, Balto ended up being the hero because he and Hassan were the ones to cross the finish line, which you can see. They actually had him recreate it later that afternoon after delivering the serum to Nome. This had become a major media sensation. Newspapers around the country were, breathlessly reporting on the situation of the children in Nome and the Great Race, and excitedly following the developments. And in the end, it was Balto. In the end, they completed the run in record time. The children were saved. Yes, imagine, if you will, the headlines that would be produced now if such a thing were to happen. In fact, imagine the headlines that are going to come out of the current pandemic that we're living in, and how contrived and awful they're going to be. In the end, only, I think, 4 or 5 children died of diphtheria. Though that's just the official count, it is entirely likely that a large number of children in the Inuit community around Nome died of diphtheria and just were not reported. But without the antitoxin, there was a risk of this disease having a 100% fatality rate. It is a truly deadly bacteria. And in the end, Balto and Sapala and all those good boys and mushers saved hundreds of children, thousands of people, and brought hope back to Nome. It was also sort of the all people. It probably would have killed. I don't know the fatality rate for adults, but it is pretty high without treatment. I think it may also be 100%. It's actually, that's a great question. I don't actually know how much it cost. I was looking for estimates, but you'd be surprised. None of what I read discussed the cost of treating these children, or whether or not it was worth sending all of this valuable serum to a tiny town in Nome, Alaska. A different time. Different time. Interestingly, the next year, I think it was Coolidge signed into law the Kelly Act, which allowed aviation companies and airmail companies to bid on mail contracts and deliver mail. It would be a few more years before regular air routes were established between Nome and the rest of the country, but by the 1930s, it was pretty common, and you no longer had to rely on dog sled teams to take it the rest of the way. In the end, Wrongfont Thompson and his friends got their way, for better or for worse. Nome and those parts of Alaska became better connected. Nobody had to worry about epidemics. Yes, so the Iditarod, actually, this is part of sorry, let me get back to this. The Iditarod is actually a historical trail, but I believe, so the Iditarod, I actually meant to talk about the Iditarod more, and then I got totally distracted by airplanes and diphtheria. But somebody can correct him, but it's actually, the Iditarod is a old traditional trail. Yes, the Inuit community did receive serum and treatments. However, they were very suspicious of generally white people and disease overall, and so often didn't bring their children in for treatment. So they were not withholding the serum from the native population, but because of how bad the influenza epidemic had been, they didn't really trust the doctors. And so that is why some people suspect that there were more indigenous children who died than was officially recorded. So the Iditarod is an old trail used by native Athabascans when they were dog sledding for hundreds and hundreds of years, and partially because of the Great Serum Run, but also just to celebrate the tradition of dog sledding. In the 1970s, I already forgot their names. Some people in Alaska started the Iditarod, which is a super cool race where you dog sled from. I don't think it's exactly the same route as the Serum Run, but it's close. Follow Blair Braverman on Twitter. She's great. She did the Iditarod with her very good boys. Also, just I think the next year or the year after, they developed a immunization for diphtheria, and because of the drama, because of the way that the whole country was captured by this episode of Nome, there was a very substantial boost and enthusiastic project of immunization. There was a whole sweep of diphtheria immunizations, and I think they're British. I'm not actually sure. I found them on the internet. And diphtheria was largely wiped out in the United States. It is still a disease that plagues us today. There have been outbreaks in Haiti, in Russia, in parts of India in recent years. They're usually not as deadly as they used to be. But they it still plagues us. It's a really, really unpleasant way to get sick and to die. And part of the reason why we don't have to face it so much is because of this serum rum. And part of what is so, I know, terrible teeth. Part of what's so interesting about this to me is that we all know Balto, right? We all know this story. There's a statue of him in Central Park. You know, he's a hero, and not that he doesn't deserve to be a hero, but the truth is that there were dozens and dozens of people involved in making this happen, and hundreds of dogs. And the real story is one of, and sorry to be a cliche, but it's teamwork, right? It's people working together. It's everyone putting aside their differences to save lives and make things happen. And that's the kind of... Actually, what happened to Balto is really kind of tragic. He ended up being sort of like a traveling zoo exhibition for a few years. I think Hassan rescued him later, but for the next few years he lived in really squalid conditions with a bunch of other sled dogs sort of traveling around the country so people could see him. But it's a great story. It's a great story, and it's a shame that we focus so much on just one single lead dog when a dog sled team is really this most wonderful example of needing to work together. You can't, one dog can't haul the sled by his or herself. And so I don't know. You love to hear about Balto. You love to hear about a good dog, a good boy. You love to hear about heroes. There's an editorial in the New York Sun that I thought really, part of this really summed it up really well. And it says, it reads, "Science made the antitoxin that is in Nome today, but science could not get it there. All the mechanical transportation marvels of modern times faltered in the presence of the elements. Other engines might freeze and choke, but that oldest of all motors, the heart, whose fuel is blood and whose spark is courage, never stalls but once." So, thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Radical History. I'll stick around. Anybody have any questions for me? Want to ask about diphtheria or sled dogs or Nome or anything like that? Otherwise, I'm out of booze, so I'm gonna go get some more. Enjoy quarantine. Everybody stay safe, stay inside, solidarity, all the best, and have a good weekend.